Good evening to all of you, and regards from Cedars-Sinai Alumni Association. Um, this event is about one in many that we have been doing for the last 15 years, and that's quite a bit. And before I speak about the program, I want to speak about the spirit of the alumni. We have an outreach to many alumni, but we still have a lot of work to do. There are hundreds of alumni in across the United States and the world that have not been part of us. And Dr. Norman Lepore, who is the president of the organization, is trying to rekindle the spirit of the alumni starting this year. And hopefully, together with the lectures and his efforts, we'll be able to build a robust organization. We have two people here featured in this evening, and I'll start with Esther Blaugrund, Romano Blaugrund. She has been the brain behind a lot of our lectures for the last 15 years. She got her training mostly about 30 years ago when she served in Radio Free Europe. And then she was an analyst, and she did a lot of things. She knew how to do research and how to interview. And so she is the star that is going to interview Dr. Lee. So who is Dr. Lee? I knew Dr. Lee, and so did many of you, when he was a cardiac surgeon at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. I knew that he had a artistic background in his family, and and his nickname is Levy, and he's Lee Levy, correct?
That's right.
Yeah.
Just
Okay.
your nickname.
So, but I knew that he was a meticulous surgeon, and we worked together very closely. And I can tell you, he didn't mind to take risks, and that's the way we saved a lot of people together. And then I lost him because he went to Centinela Hospital, which for a while changed the name to Sentinel Lee because Dr. Lee was there. And then he was lost to follow-up. And then I went one day to listen to the Data Symphony, and who I see there? Dr. Lee as the president of this organization. Since then, we have been connected again. So recently we thought that the history of Myles Lee deserves more attention than just knowing that he's the president of the Data Symphony. And we asked our star, Esther Blaugrund, to interview him. I didn't think it would take so much effort to create this interview, but they met several times and created what will be hopefully a perfect interview. So now what I'm going to do is pass the baton to Esther to start the evening.
Well, thank you for your kind words, Dr. Haruzi, and welcome everyone. It's so nice to see your reunion of doctors. You probably haven't seen each other in, I don't know, decades or whatever, but it's a nice feeling that you're all together now. And I have the distinct honor to introduce and interview our distinguished guest, Dr. Myles Lee, Cedars-Sinai alumnus, and as you will see, a veritable Renaissance man. Dr. Lee is an eminent cardiothoracic surgeon, board certified 3 times, a senior member of the American Association for Thoracic Surgery, and a fellow of the American College of Surgeons. Dr. Lee will share with us how he synthesized his 40-year career, his 40-year cardiac surgery career, with his passions for history, music, literature, and art that continues to this day. So Dr. Lee, let us start from the beginning. You were born in Boston and you stem from a highly regarded family of scholars and artists. Can you tell us about your family?
Yeah, I'll say a few words with prefacing things by saying that the quickest way to become a bore is to tell everything. So I'm going to keep it as brief as I can and yet, make the point. My father was a professor of English and journalism at the University of Pennsylvania, and he was first vice dean of the Annenberg School of Communications. He was also literary editor of the Philadelphia Record and the Boston Herald. He had a radio and television shows in Philadelphia called Arts and Review, and Arts and Review ran for almost 5,000 shows. He wrote a novel and several anthologies, and was basically a student of the English language. His identical twin brother, my uncle, was a presidential speechwriter for President Eisenhower. He was one of the original Mad Men. He started his career with Young and Rubicam on Madison Avenue. So he was one of the real Mad Men. And he was also vice president of programming for NBC. And his job was to review pilots that came in. And some of the pilots he reviewed were the Johnny Carson Show, Gunsmoke, Bonanza, and Dr. Kildare, and he referred them to the president of NBC. And fortunately, he put those shows on the air. The other thing that my uncle did was create the original Addams Family that ran in 1962 to 64. My mother, not to leave my mother out of this, my mother was talented musically. I do have a picture of her here, and her talent was that you could put a piece of music in front of her as she sat at the piano, whether it was anything from the classics to jazz, and she would sit there and play that piece just the way you and I read a book. She was just remarkable at the piano. My cousin, Lance Lee, is a professional poet, and he has 2 new books that are available on Amazon, Becoming Human and Elemental Natures. And my niece, Rachel, is an investigative journalist. She's published in the Chicago Tribune, the New York Times. She's written several books, and her latest one is called No Visible Bruises. It's about domestic violence, and it was in the New York Times top 10 bestseller list in 2019. So that's kind of where I came from.
That's not bad.
I guess some of the genes rubbed
The
off.
gene pool, it's your gene pool. You graduated Harvard in 1961 with a BA degree cum laude in art history. So you major in the fine arts rather than science, with what seems to be also a keen interest in Asian studies. So tell us briefly about your Harvard studies, and when did you first feel an inclination or affinity for medicine?
Well, I knew when I entered college that I was going to go into medicine. There was no single cataclysmic event that occurred that made me do that. I just didn't like being helpless when people needed help. I think that was basically it. So I knew I was going into medicine and taking the basic pre-medical courses. And because I was going to do that, I decided to major in a non-science. I knew in medical school I was going to get physiology, biochemistry, genetics, and all of that. So I said to myself, well, I'm going to major in the arts. And because patients bring to you a lot more than their diseases, they bring their whole life story to you. And the more you know, the more you can talk to people about. So I decided to major in the arts, and I had just been in a play when I was in high school called Lute Song. Lute Song was on Broadway, starred Yul Brynner, and it had an Asian motif, a Chinese motif. And the thing that struck me about that play was the music, which was just, to me, it was just overwhelming. So I decided to major in fine arts, and because of this recent Asian connection and the large Asian community at Harvard, I decided to major in Asian art, and wrote an honors thesis on Chinese landscape painting of the Sung Dynasty. At the same time, I was running to the physics lab and studying Korean. So my last year in college was quite busy.
So right after Harvard, you begin your medical studies at Tufts Medical School in Boston. Are there any outstanding memories from Tufts?
Oh, there's so many, but I'm going to mention just two. The first one was my very first day in medical school. We're all sitting there in histology class in front of our microscopes. And our professor, Sam Magruder, in a stiff white coat, starts literally marching back and forth in front of the class with his arms behind his back. And then he stopped, faced the class, and he said to us, pointing at us, "You are responsible for the skin and its contents." That was the very first thing I was told in medical school. And, being somewhat obsessive compulsive as surgeons have to be, I took that to heart and basically nearly reduced myself to tears the first night I was studying Gray's Anatomy, because the amount of detail involved for learning, one muscle or a muscle group was just so overwhelming. I thought it would be more than I could deal with. But I took it seriously in the sense that later on, when I became a surgeon, I determined that I initially wasn't sure if I wanted to be in medicine or surgery. And then it occurred to me after I talked to a pathologist friend of mine that if I were a surgeon, I could do anything an internist did if I put my mind to it. But an internist couldn't do what I could do as a surgeon. So that's how I ended up in surgery. But that's a little side comment. The other major thing that happened to me at Tufts was that when I was a medical student there, Jack Matloff was chief resident in chest surgery. And that's where I met Jack. And I guess I must have made some kind of impression on him, because when I asked him for a job at Cedars, he gave it to me.
Well, in
There are many more things I could talk about, but we should move along.
Okay, in 1962, you're a 21-year-old medical student and journalist with a press card who ventures out some 10,000 miles to Laos to render some medical assistance there. That's quite an adventure for a 21-year-old. How did all this come about?
Well, that's a very long story. And again, I want to make it brief. But basically, this trip occurred right after my first year in medical school. And I had heard about Tom Dooley, who was an American Navy doctor who had set up refugee camps in Haiphong in Vietnam after the French were driven out of Indochina, as it was called then, in 1954. And the thing about that was that Tom Dooley was a doctor in Asia. So he kind of fused my two fields of interest together into one. And I went to Asia. I had written to him and asked him if I could work with his organization for a summer. They could only take me for a year. And as this went back and forth, several things happened. He died at the age of 34 from melanoma. And then a lot of his hospitals were under communist control by the time I got there. So when I went to Laos, I went to the American embassy, and how I got there is another long story, but I asked to see the ambassador, who I had a letter of introduction to. he wasn't there, but I got invited to a party at the embassy the next night, where I met every member of the Lao coalition government. I met Savanabong, the communist. I met Savannah Puma, the neutralist, and Boon the rightist. And there was also an American health official who was being honored that night. And he told me about a group called Operation Brotherhood, which was run by Filipinos in the southern part of Laos. So I hooked up with Operation Brotherhood. I went down to this 50-bed hospital, little village called Pak Song. And that was the very first time I was ever in an operating room, was in that hospital.
It's
So
amazing.
also, while I was there, I came upon two young men who had had their legs blown off by landmines. And I measured their legs. And when I got back to Boston, I gave a couple of talks about my trip and, had a couple of prostheses made and sent them over to them. So those are two of the things, but there was so much more. I mean, how I almost became a member of the royal family, that's another story, but we'll save that for another time. She was unbelievable. But
So we'll
the
go
royal
on.
family would visit this little hospital that I was in because it was the liveliest place in town. The Green Berets would bring in every weekend a case or two of beer. We had a gasoline run generator out in back that allowed the record machine to play, and there was a lot of dancing and carrying on. And the royal family did come to that hospital on weekends, and I met quite a few of them there. But I'll save that for another time.
Right, so we'll go on. After, this is during the Vietnam War, after 3 years in South Korea of Army service, you as a major in the U.S. Army Medical Corps and a 2-year cardiothoracic surgery residency in Boston, you become Cedars' own in 1976. You joined Cedars-Sinai Medical Center's cardiothoracic surgery staff. You are with Cedars-Sinai 11 years, saving scores and scores of lives. So tell us some of your memorable days at Cedar in the OR,
Okay, this is,
yeah, your colleagues, wait a minute, just your colleagues and relationships then. And in general, the extraordinary people you met in the medical and outside of the medical profession, please.
okay, this is, I'll try to condense a pretty intense experience into just a few minutes.
Yeah.
By the time I got in the Cedars, I decided on cardiac surgery as a career. And that happened after I had done 150 heart valve implantations when I was a second-year general surgery resident in Brooklyn, New York, under Phil Sawyer, who was head of the electrochemistry and biophysics lab at Downstate, and he was also chief of vascular surgery there. Phil introduced me into the rights, so to say, of surgery. And I remember as chief resident on his service, taking over the vascular service, which had 36 male beds and 36 female beds. I came into the hospital on Sunday morning and didn't go home until Wednesday night.
Yeah.
I stayed there until I had known every patient, taken 7 or 8 of them to the OR, admitted new people, and so forth. And while I was on the service, by the way, one of my patients was Willie Sutton. You remember who he was. Willie Sutton was the bank robber who said, someone asked him, Willie, why do you keep robbing banks? And he said, you go where the money is. So I had Willie came into the hospital with claudication. So in those days, when we did aortograms, we did them. The radiologists didn't. And I remember sticking a 14 gauge needle that was about 8 inches long into Willie Sutton's back and injecting the dye into his back. And then as the dye circulated, we moved the X-ray cassette down his body, and we got a good view of his the vasculature in his legs, which was basically inoperable. So I sent him home on some Guinness Stout, and he did fine after that. As far as getting back, so that's kind of a little background, and getting to Cedars. Well, I mean, the stories at Cedars are endless. I mean, there's Jack Matloff, and who gave me the opportunity in the first place, the ability to work with Jeremy Swan and Willie Gans, both as friends and colleagues, was just an incredible experience. And of course, there was always Dr. Jacuzzi, Haruzzi, sorry about that, who would invariably come to me on a Friday afternoon with a patient who needed bypass surgery and offhandedly mentioned, well, he had an ejection fraction of 10%. And I said, okay, Tsar, let's do a dobutamine stress echo on him. And if you can demonstrate to me that you can recruit some function, I'll operate on him. And that's exactly what happened. And I operated on him and he did fine. And that's how we used to work together. We had a very collegial relationship with a lot of kidding around. Other colleagues in my life, kind of after Cedars, when I went to Centinela, Norman Shumway, who did the first US heart transplant, became a friend of mine. Norman would come to Centinela and review my program every year. And Denton Cooley, who I'm sure you all know who Denton Cooley was, he knew about my book, Near Misses in Cardiac Surgery, and he was kind enough to write a preface for the book and let me put his name on the cover. My most memorable day at Cedars in the OR was the day I did 3 cases. I did 3 open hearts in a row. And in those days, we didn't have people to open and close for us and put people on bypass. We did the whole thing from beginning to end. The first case was a double mammary in a 78-year-old woman who sent me postcards every year for the next 10 years. I replaced a thrombosed mitral valve prosthesis. And the last case of the day was a 36-year-old man who had chest pain after bench pressing 500 pounds. So I fixed his aortic dissection. That was April 17th, 1987. I'll never forget that day. Other memorable people I met at Cedars, and I know people who are watching there's a laundry list of people that I met and operated on: Vincent Minnelli, Henry Fonda, Danny Kaye, John Forsyth, Ella Fitzgerald. And those are people I operate on, or at least assisted on. And other people that I've met, not in the hospital: Andy Warhol, that's another story, and Sir Edmund Hillary, and we'll get to him later. But I want to talk about a patient that I did operate on with Jack, and it was Milton Berle. And when Milton came into the hospital, I knew that he knew my family in Philadelphia for years. And my father, with his arts and review activities, would go to all the openings of all the major shows, dance shows, museum openings, theater openings, things like that. When Milton came into town, Milton knew that my father, with his mother, my grandmother, would be in the audience, and he knew where they'd be sitting, and he would invariably tease my grandmother in front of the whole audience. And he'd point to her and he'd say, "Lily, I remember you. You heckled me 10 years ago, Lily. I never forget a dress." And as though she were wearing the same dress that night as she was wearing 10 years ago. And the interesting thing is, this is his autobiography. And he wrote, you can't see it, I'm sure, but he did inscribe it to my grandmother, for Lily Levy, a wonderful woman with respect and admiration, loved Milton Berle. When my grandmother passed away, my father inscribed it to me. And after Milton started feeling better in the hospital, then I told him who I was. And I brought the book in and Milton signed it to me. And he said to Myles, you know, wonderful guy, wonderful son, I love Lily, Uncle Milty.
Yeah.
So that was Milton Berle. And then one other story I'll tell. This doesn't involve a Cedars patient, but I'm mentioning it because I'm going to mention Will Durant a little later. You all know Will and Ariel Durant, who wrote the 11-volume story of civilization. And I got to know them pretty well, and I have a correspondence with Will Durant. And I was at this dinner party with him and Ariel and a couple of other people. And I had brought one of his books to autograph for me. And I said, you know, Dr. Will, that's how he liked to be called. I said, you know, after spending 50 years writing the story of civilization, about everything that's happened in the last 5,000 years, are you an optimist or a pessimist? So he turns to the woman sitting next to him, and he picks up the hem of her skirt between his thumb and his forefinger, and he said, you know, as long as there's a beautiful woman in the world, I'm an optimist. So that's Will Durant, but I'll get back to him a little later.
Okay, so you leave Cedars-Sinai in 1987 to become the director of cardiothoracic surgery at Centinela Medical Center for a span of 13 years. You have the distinction of performing among the earliest surgical ablation procedures in Los Angeles.
Yeah, that's correct. I'll just keep this very brief. I did among the first AV and SA node ablations using cryoablation, as well as Wolf Parkinson White procedures. And the significant thing about that was not only that my program was one of the first to do them, but I worked with Ellie Gang, who came over to Centinela and did all the electrophysiology for me as I was doing the surgical procedures. So that was a very nice experience. Of course, then the catheters came along, and that was the end of that. All these procedures can be done with catheters, more or less, these days.
Okay, we'll go on. So at this point, I just wanted to briefly interject something that connects Cedars and Centinela, and about your mountain trekking hobby, a long-standing, long hobby of yours. And specifically, your 1985 trek to Mount Everest.
Right. Well, first of all of these books behind me in these two shelves right here, they're all books about mountaineering, all of them. What happened was, so I've had a long time interest in mountaineering, and I've never was a technical climber, but I did a lot of trekking. At any rate, about 1984, my father sent me a Himalayan calendar with a picture of Mount Everest on it. And my father was always an armchair explorer. He was friends with Richard Byrd, the Antarctic explorer. And Admiral Byrd invited my father to go with him on one of these expeditions, and he didn't do it. My father did write an anthology of Antarctic and Arctic exploration called Snow, Ice, and Penguins, but he never would take a trip like that. But when my father sent me this Himalayan calendar, I said, I'm going to do this trip, and I'm going to send him a photograph from that same spot. Well, it so happened that right after that, I hurt my knee playing softball. I think I tore my ACL then, and it got better very slowly, but it did get better. And once it got better, I decided I'd better go to the Mount Everest region while I can still walk and talk. So I started getting into shape by going up the stairs at Cedars. And I'd go up one step at a time, 2 steps at a time. I'd do 3 flights, then 5 flights, then 6. And then I'd do the whole routine all over again with 5-pound ankle weights. So finally, I got over there to Nepal in October of 1985, and our group was led by a Sherpa called Ansharing. He summited Mount Everest and actually took the first woman who ever made it to the top to get up there. And he was quite a guy. And what happened was about a year later, the group I was traveling with, we were all informed that Ansharing had a cardiac problem. So we all raised money for him. And by the way, just in case you're wondering, anyone recognize this guy? This is yours truly in Ansharing's house. This is the Sherpa's house. And that's how I looked when I was there after a month out at 15 below at night. But Ansharing had a cardiac problem, and so we raised money to bring him to the United States. He arrived in San Francisco, visited Yosemite on the way to Los Angeles. And when he was in Yosemite, he said, "My God, why do you people come to Nepal? This place is so beautiful." But he did come to Centinela, and we did work him up. I had my cardiologists work him up, and we found out that probably his arrhythmias were a result of chewing on betel nuts too much. So he stopped that. I don't remember if he was put on a beta blocker or not, but at any rate, that was the extent of his workup, and he did fine after that. So that's the connection of mountaineering with Cedars and
Sentinel.
both.
Yeah. But I thought the training for Mount Everest you did at Cedars, walking up and down Cedars stairway. That's hilarious.
Yeah, and it's hard to define what a flight is at Cedars because, I mean, there's you go and say start on one floor and then there's a level in between the floors. So, you know, there are a lot of stairs.
Right. Anyway, we'll go on. During your long medical career, you authored numerous scientific papers and gained wide recognition with your textbook entitled Near Misses in Cardiac Surgery. It was published in 1992. Here it is.
Here it is.
As a teaching tool, right? Since then, it was used as a teaching tool and still selling strongly after 30 years.
That's right. This
Yeah,
thing-
I just wanted to ask you, of course, you should show the 2 editions. And then what are the lessons to be learned from near misses in cardiac surgery?
Okay. Basically, this book has become a classic in the sense that it's still in print and still used after 30 years without being updated. So it's a book about teamwork more than it is about surgical technique or surgical mishaps. It involves, you know, surgical problems, but it also involved anesthetic problems. Patients, for example, I did a double valve on an elderly man. He did fine. His ejection fraction post-op was excellent, but his blood pressure was 70. Couldn't get him off dopamine, couldn't get him off the ventilator. So I went through my checklist. He's not septic, he's not hypovolemic, and his heart is working fine. And so I said, well, let's send off a cortisol level, and we'll send off thyroid studies too. I mean, this is just the kind of checklist I had by basically being an internist who operates. I mean, I just ran through all these things in my mind. And while I was waiting for the results of the thyroid studies to come back, I just gave him some thyroid. And within 6 hours, he was off the ventilator, wide awake, off dopamine, and asking where his bridge partners were. So that's the kind of thing the book is about. And another case where a patient was intubated, happened to be a radiologist at the old Cedars. and anesthesia was having trouble ventilating him. And I said, take out the tube. We'll just re-intubate him. We took out the tube, and one of his front teeth was in the side hole of the endotracheal tube and blocking the main tube itself. So it's things like this that are in the book, and they're problems that are not related to the latest therapeutic measures. So it's been used. So it's basically a book about teamwork, and there are 42 cases, and the reader, I wrote it in the second person present tense, so the reader becomes the surgeon. You become the surgeon. And there are 42 cases, and going in that they all survive. So you have to figure out what's going on from the description. And then you turn the page, you find out what happened. There's some references, a discussion and references. Well, this is, I think, how this book survived for 30 years without a revision, because these problems are basic and they're not dependent upon, the latest techniques. They're not surgical misadventures. So one day I'm sitting in this room that I'm sitting in. I got an email from the chief of cardiac surgery at the Mass General. And his current co-chief is Duke Cameron, who's the former chief at Johns Hopkins. Both of them had been using near misses in their residency programs for years. So they asked me if I would like to have them update the book, because, in the sense that there would be cases now involving interventional techniques, the percutaneous valve replacements, endovascular aortic aneurysm repair, and things like, there are a whole bunch of things that have come along that weren't around when I wrote the first edition. So I was very glad, and I said absolutely, because I can tell you it was a lot more fun to write about these things than it was to live through them. So it turns out that this is the second edition. It came out in March. Thor Sunt and Duke Cameron are both former presidents of the American Association for Thoracic Surgery, and Jim Cox, who invented the Mays procedure and who I took courses from in St. Louis, is a friend of mine, and he was kind enough to write the foreword. And he's a past president of the AATS. So this book is now in the hands of 3 former presidents of the AATS and me. So that was the greatest thing that I think happened in my career. In terms of lessons learned, there are a few. The first thing is that you can't follow your patients, you have to lead them. And by that, I mean, you have to think outside the box. The patients don't know where they're going, and they're going to lead you down a rat hole, and you're going to be chasing after their coattails. So you have to try and stay ahead of the game, pursue every abnormal lab result. And like that case I mentioned before, the patient with the double valve on dopamine for no obvious reason was hypothyroid, and nobody had diagnosed it before. But I was thinking outside the box, and that's how that patient survived. And a corollary to this is decisions are more important than incisions. And this means, to me, you have to have a significant non-surgical as well as surgical knowledge base to really determine the risks and benefits. And as I said before, I tried to become an internist who operates. Every patient brings a different disease, and when that patient came in, I'd read up on that disease if I didn't know anything about it, so I was ready for the next one. The other lesson, it's not really a lesson, but I've heard people say, well, these cardiac surgeons, they're so full of themselves, they think they're gods. Well, I can tell you something, God doesn't sweat the way we did. So that's not true. And to wrap this part up, I'll get back to my friend Will Durant, who wrote this little book called The Lessons of History. And Will Durant, when I asked him the question, is he an optimist or a pessimist? He jokingly picked up that lady's skirt and said he's an optimist as long as there's a pretty woman around. But he said, look, you asked me about the lessons of history, and he pointed to one sentence on the last page of this little book. And he said, and he wrote there, if a man is fortunate, he will, before he dies, gather up as much as he can of his civilized heritage and transmit it to his children. And I think that's what we've done with this near misses in cardiac surgery in the medical field. Because this book has been around for over 30 years, and now in an updated second edition, it's going to be around a lot longer, and it'll be updated probably every 5 years. And so I like to think that, in a sense, we did the same thing with near misses that Will Durant did with the lessons of history. Just drawing conclusions from all the work that we did in the field.
We'll go on now, right?
Go on, yes.
You've also written the book, The Donation, a novel and a medical thriller. And it's the story of a man's search for redemption for his son. That's it. I ordered it, by the way, yesterday.
Thank you.
Yeah. And the story is of a man's search for redemption for his son in the context of shortages of organ donors for cardiac transplantations. And yeah, I'm very anxious to read it. I'll be getting it in a day.
Yeah, basically it's a story that involves a major collision between medicine and the criminal justice system, that in a single stroke nearly destroys a surgeon's career and brings down a hospital. It involves I worked in prisons before, so I know something about what goes on in prisons. I worked in the Brooklyn House of Detention for Men. I was in Rikers Island and the Queens House of Detention for Men. So a lot of this book revolves around the criminal justice system, and I'm not sure how to go into this story anymore, except to say that it has a lot of twists and turns, and it has a bizarre way of solving the organ donor shortage. But I wrote it in a bizarre way with twists and turns so it would attract attention. Ironically, the textbook has outsold the novel.
Good.
Because marketing,
What it anyway.
marketing is everything. 150,000 books coming out every year. I mean, I knew exactly where to send near misses in cardiac surgery, but trying to market one of 150,000 books is a lot more difficult. So
Well,
at any
you got
rate,
one customer.
thank you. I'm very
Okay.
grateful.
Now, let us turn to your involvement in music, Dr. Lee. You're currently the president of the Los Angeles Doctors Symphony Orchestra, a position you've held for the past 9 years. And the Doctors Orchestra is planning a live concert on November 20th of this year. And we encourage all of you to support and attend the Doctors Orchestra's concerts in general. And let us start with the upcoming November 20 performance. You'll all receive flyers of the program very shortly. I just want to mention the concerts are generally, they take place in Culver City, right? And parking is ample and available, right?
Well, Culver City and Santa Monica.
And Santa Monica, well, I only saw the Culver City one for
Yeah.
November 20, right?
Yeah, in both places.
Yeah. So of course, one should.
Well,
support.
thank you for plugging that. I'll just say the orchestra has been in existence since 1953.
Wow.
And it was started by a physician, and initially all physicians, but it has since evolved so that we we take in non-physicians as well as musicians, but it's still mostly an all-volunteer orchestra.
So now we'll go on to your, an ardent scholar of American history. You were the librettist or writer for the orchestral portraits of 4 US presidents, Washington, Jefferson, and both Roosevelt. You collaborated with composer-conductor Victoria Bond, and it was entitled Soul of a Nation. It was issued on a CD in 2018 by Albany Records. Oh, good. So you have it here. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, let me tell you a little bit about this. By the way, I want to introduce everybody to Victoria Bond.
Ooh,
Victoria's waving. She's sitting there in the blue sweater.
where
And
is,
I'm absolutely thrilled she was able to be
That's-
with us.
yeah.
But this is a very interesting story. Victoria and I have had a 19-year collaboration that started on New Year's Day. I think it was 2003, 7 o'clock in the morning. I was up taking a walk. Victoria and her husband were coming down the hill, and who's vertical at 7 o'clock in the morning on New Year's Day? Well, we were, and we stopped to talk, and one word led to another. And it turned out that we had a mutual interest in American history. So I got to meet her mother, who was a concert pianist and lived right up the street from us. I had no idea. And then Victoria came over here and came into this library, which I can't show you right now, but it goes down this way about 20 feet. And I've got 15 shelves of books on the George Washington and the American Revolution down that way. So Victoria saw these books and she said, gee, you know, I wrote an opera called A More Perfect Union. It was about the Constitutional Convention of 1787. And I've also written an opera called Mrs. President about Victoria Woodhull, who ran for president against Grant in 1872. So she saw my Washington books. She asked me, do you know, you've heard the Lincoln Portrait? I said, sure. You know, it's been, Aaron Copland, it's been recorded by Charlton Heston, Henry Fonda, and Gregory Peck. She turns to me and she says, we should write a Washington portrait. I said, well, Victoria, you're a pro. And by the way, Victoria was the first woman to get a doctorate in orchestral conducting from the Juilliard School. And she's worked with conductors like Herbert von Karajan, and she was Aaron Copland's assistant at one point, and she's conducted orchestras all around the world. And her website is victoriabond.com, and she has a list of things that she's written that's as long as both my arms. And she could set the Manhattan telephone directory of music. She's so talented. At any rate, she said, we should do the Washington portrait. I said, you want a pro to do this? I'm just an historical hobbyist. She said, no, I want you. So I started to write, and fortunately I'd taken some notes, and I kind of knew what I wanted to say about George Washington. While I was writing, I just picked up the phone and made a totally cold call to Mount Vernon. And I said, may I speak to the executive director, please? And he gets on the phone, and for the next 45 minutes, I'm talking to him about this piece we're writing. Make a long story short, they had just built a 300-seat theater underground at Mount Vernon. Jim Reese, who was executive director at Mount Vernon, donated the theater for our rehearsal and for the performance. He invited all the guests, printed all the programs, and all we had to do was show up. And then after the performance, he had a party for us on the piazza overlooking the Potomac. And we had free access to at least 6 rooms in Mount Vernon, which you can't do, you know, when you're herded through there during the day. At any rate, we said, gee, that was a hell of an experience. You know, what are we going to do next? Now, So we started searching for other presidents. Now, one thing you have to understand is that Victoria and I are at opposite ends of the political spectrum. I mean, we are really opposite. And yet here we are 19 years later, still writing about political figures and talking to each other. So basically, the next pieces we wrote were on Thomas Jefferson and both Roosevelts. They were ultimately all recorded at the Chicago College of Performing Arts. Our work was supported by Henry Fogel, who was former president of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, and at the time he was dean of the Chicago College of Performing Arts. And we had soloists from the Milwaukee and Chicago Symphony Orchestras that were playing on this recording. So that's the story about the recording, and we can go on to the next.
Yeah, because you wrote a piece on Winston Churchill and his support for the Jewish state.
Yes. Now, not many people know about Churchill's lifelong support for Jewish state. And I had originally written a piece on Churchill, Victoria and I had planned to do. And I'd written it envisioning Churchill as a modern day King Arthur, which if you go back and I read what Churchill wrote about King Arthur, and I had some quotes from what Churchill said about King Arthur, and I put them in the piece I wrote. And after 8 months of trying to get permission from Churchill's estate to use these quotations, I was getting absolutely nowhere. So I said, well, there's only one way to deal with this. So I looked up members of Churchill's family that were still alive, and I found his granddaughter, Celia Sandus. And I looked her up on, and I checked her out on YouTube. She seemed to be a very approachable woman. And she loved lecturing about her grandfather. So I sent Celia an email at midnight one night detailing what Victoria and I had done. And we're having all kinds of trouble with Churchill's literary estate getting permission to use these 300, I don't know how many words, a few words. So I sent her this email along with a copy of Soul of the Nation. And I don't know why I woke up at 2:30 in the morning, but I did. And in 2.5 hours, she responded to me. And she started, the first thing she said in her email was, send me the tools and I will finish the job. And she started out her email that way. And she was quoting Winston Churchill, who said, send me the tools and we'll finish the job, when Churchill gave a speech at Harrow and in 1940 asking Roosevelt for destroyers. And so when I approached Churchill's estate for permission to use the quotes on this new piece about Churchill's relationship to Jewish people and support for Jewish state, they knew where I was coming from, and I had permission in a week. There was no fooling around this time. But I rewrote it because the piece was performed at the Cleveland Institute of Music under the auspices of the Aronson Cello Festival. And Lev Aronson was a concentration camp escapee. He went on to become principal cellist of the Dallas Symphony, and he taught famous cellists such as Lynn Harrell, who recently passed away, John Sharp, who's the current principal cellist of the Chicago Symphony, Mitch Maxwell, who's principal of the Dallas Opera, and so on. So that's the story about Churchill.
So do you want to show the bust that you did of Churchill? I see it here behind you.
Oh, yeah. Well, actually, this is one I did of
On Theodore Roosevelt.
yeah, this is one I did of Theodore Roosevelt.
Yeah.
A sculptor friend who taught me how to sculpt.
Hmm.
So this was my second attempt at sculpture. My first attempt was over here.
Oh,
That's the
oh,
first
it
one
ain't
I said.
Churchill.
That's not Churchill. And this one is not
this-
mine totally. This was originally a wine stopper, and the face had already been made. And I have it over there. I won't bother getting it, but suffice to say, I made the torso, and I thickened Churchill's neck in the back and in the front, added the cigar, and made it look more like Churchill than it did on the
Yeah,
wine stopper.
all
But
right. Now
on to,
we have to go on now, no?
yeah,
Do you want to say something still on Churchill?
no,
Okay. So now to your great passion of fine art photography. I have read that you are a well-recognized artist in the field of abstract expressionism, with many of your works and images residing in private collections coast to coast, as well as in the permanent collection of the Monterey Peninsula Community Hospital. I have a question. Are any of your artworks displayed at Cedars-Sinai's hospital's vast art galleries? Do you have anything there?
no, I'm very flattered that you would
Yeah,
associate my photography with what I know to be in the Cedars collection, because I was around when Marcia Weissman and two of her associates were initially hanging the pictures on the wall in 1976. And no, but I think, since you asked that,
yeah,
I think it might be very nice if Cedars could come up with the idea of devoting part of its art collection to works done by physicians. The American Medical Association did this. They, in the Journal of the American Medical Association, I don't know if they still do it, but they used to have either a painting or a photograph by a physician on the cover of every issue. And the American Association for Thoracic Surgery does the same thing. They solicited me and other people to submit artwork that they display on monitors that circle the exhibition hall at some of their major annual meetings. So, yeah, I think I did get the community hospital, the Monterey Peninsula, where, by the way, Richard Gray, who was a former colleague of ours at Cedars, Richard is now at the community hospital of the Monterey Peninsula. So, it would be nice if Cedars could consider
I just
having
thought,
the physicians submit work.
right. By the way, Dr. Lee's artworks can be viewed on Instagram by linking to the @ Myles Lee Photography, Myles Lee Photography, Instagram. Now, we're almost towards the end,
Yeah, let me just,
I just wanted to say that we're lucky here because we have you, Dr. Lee, the artist, to explain your work, as our own Sandra Pat, the administrator of Cedars-Sinai Alumni Association, exhibits some visuals of your art. Very few, but
before she does that, I just want to say really quick that
yes,
most of what I do are, I'll take an ordinary scene that most people would look at as a postcard scene of some kind, but I convert them to abstract expressionist images that subordinate the reality of what I'm looking at to common denominators of form, composition, balance, color, texture, and so forth. So, I mean, these are things that people would just walk by and not even look at twice. So I like abstract expressionism, and Sandra's going to show a couple of images in a second, but I do like taking pictures of birds. For example, this is one. I had to wait an hour and a half for this bird to take off. And then the other thing I'm into is what's called intentional camera motion photography. This is a bird of paradise flower, and it's one of about 35 variations I have on the same flower, moving the camera.
I didn't get rid of it.
What? thought I heard somebody say something.
Something, I don't know.
Yeah, at any rate, but we're going to just talk about the abstract expressionism
Mhm.
right now. So Sandra, I guess if you
A
can
few
show,
visuals, yeah.
show the first one. So this is what I mean by,
Let me
Wait,
get it up
just
for
one
you.
second.
yeah, but I'll just say by taking an ordinary object and reducing it to an abstraction with, and I'll say there's no photoshopping. So this is a seascape. This is taken at dusk up in Big Sur, and I'd rotated it 90 degrees counterclockwise. And what you're seeing in the middle, the white streak in the middle, is the residual sunlight on a wave. And the glittery stuff in the background is the reflection of sunlight on the kelp in the water. So to me, just rotating it turned it from a, and by the way, I took this picture with a 550 millimeter lens. So I was already able to zero in on a very small part of the ocean. And when I rotated it, I said, gee, this looks like a galaxy in outer space. So I called it Messier 111. Messier, as you probably know, was an 18th century French astronomer who identified 110 celestial objects with his little telescope. So I call this Messier 111. He missed one. This is a dead tree trunk. And the orange stuff in the middle is called Trentipolia. It's an algae with carotenoids instead of chlorophyll. So that's why it's orange. And to me, it looks like a Jackson Pollock painting. It's like paint that he would have splattered on a canvas. So I call this channeling Jackson Pollock. And it was, you know, nobody would have stopped. I mean, I don't know who would have stopped to look at this dead tree trunk, but I ended up with this image. This is another tree trunk. This is a rainbow eucalyptus. Again, this one is turned 90 degrees. And I call this one Desert Sunrise because in the middle, I see the sun poking out from behind a mountain, and the rest of it kind of looks to me like something George O'Keeffe might have painted in the New Mexico desert. But it's a tree trunk and a very small part of one, maybe 6 inches square. And this is another tree trunk, another rainbow eucalyptus called, I call this one Apocalypse, because the purple area at the top to me looked like a volcano, and the red color in the foreground kind of looks like lava that's flowing out of the volcano and running all over everything, destroying everything in its path. So that's in a nutshell what I do with the abstract photography. There's no photoshopping. There is some Lightroom editing, some cropping, but otherwise I don't put things in there that weren't there already. Okay.
Oh, so now we're really in conclusion. So in the conclusion, during your long journey of saving human lives medically and enriching so many people with your knowledge and indeed creation of artworks, you must have developed some guiding principles or philosophy that hopefully you would like to impart to us.
Well, I'm very thankful that you gave me this question in advance because I had to, this took a little bit of thought to put a cohesive answer together. But basically, if you believe like Nabokov, who wrote Lolita, if you believe, as he did, that life is a sliver of light between two eternities of darkness, that what we're going through now, this is the first and the only time around for most of us. There's no opportunity to practice to get it right, to get things right, especially since life is lived forward, but understood backwards. So it's very hard to do a do-over if you mess up somewhere along the line. I remember some years ago seeing this play, and maybe some of you have seen Jersey Boys. It's about Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons. It was a fabulous show, and the Four Seasons is just a great group. And there was a line from that play toward the very end that really struck me. And it said, when someone asked Frankie Valli what it was all for, you know, those years of struggle before you hit the big time, you know, what drove you on? And he said, Frankie Valli said, I was just chasing the music, trying to get home. So that's basically, I think, what I've been doing. You know, for me, chasing the music has been doing things that I've enjoyed, either in the arts or the sciences. And trying to get home means to achieve get a sense of fulfillment while on these various journeys. You know, Theodore Roosevelt put it another way. And again, Theodore Roosevelt is one of my heroes. He was, in a sense, a self-destructive kind of guy. That's another whole story. But in 1910, he gave a speech at the Sorbonne. And basically, the essence of the speech was not to fear failure. And he said, if you're going to fail, he said, at least fail while daring greatly, so that your place shall never be among those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat. And someone asked Theodore Roosevelt, I think it was around 1913, just after he returned from a near-death experience navigating a previously unexplored river in Brazil. The reporter asked him when he got off the boat in New York, he said, Mr. President, why did you do that? You nearly died. And he nearly did. He lost 50 pounds on this trip. He got deathly ill. And he said, very simply, you know, it was my last chance to be a boy.
Oh.
And then John Greenleaf Whittier put it another way. He said, of all sad things of tongue or pen, the saddest of these might have been. And Oliver Wendell Holmes, and I think Tchaikovsky said this too, alas for those who never sing, but die with all their music in them. So these are the things that basically have driven me. You know, from the personal viewpoint, it's the journey that matters, because you have to remember what Oscar Wilde said. There are two tragedies in life. One is not getting what you want. The other is getting it. You know, once you get it, you know, it takes away all your drive, all your initiative. So it's just another way of saying it's the journey that's important. And if while you're on the way, on this journey, if you can leave the world a better place or bring humaneness to humanity, then you may have accomplished something.
Well, you certainly did. And we all want to thank you very much for coming back as Cedars alumnus to share some of your experiences as a cardiac surgeon, as well as giving us a glimpse into the wide scope of your artistic reach and accomplishments. God bless you, Dr.
Oh, thank you for this.
God bless you.
Thanks for so
Now
much.
I have a question. Andy,
Okay,
question?
thank you very much. Thank you very much for this great interview. I just want to make one comment. We didn't speak about the Delta Symphony. The Delta Symphony performs 3 or 4 times a year, mostly in Culver City. And the next concert going to be November 20th. Unfortunately, it's not going to be tango as we wanted, but it's going to be a great concert. And I recommend that the Alumni Association will, every member who loves music will go there. It's at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And from my experience, I always go because I find it fascinating. So we'll make sure that you get invitation, and then you'll see Dr. Lee as the president with a tie talking about the program. So now I'll open the session for questions.
I have a couple comments. One, you mentioned the names of your niece and your grandmother. As I recall, your uncle's name was David Levy.
Yes,
You have a good memory. Number two, as far as physicians displaying their artwork in the hospital, many of you may remember Lou Adler, who was an interventional vascular radiologist at Cedars, was a good photographer, and he had lots of action shots at Lakers games, Dodgers games, and there would be his photography displayed on the walls at Cedars-Sinai. So I don't know how he managed to do that, but that is a possibility.
We have Leo Gordon, who can be instrumental in doing that.
The intermediary.
Well, yeah, Myles, it's great to see you.
Leo, it's
It-
fabulous seeing you.
Yeah, it really is. You've always been one of the most unusual members of the Cedar staff. And, you know, the word unusual has different connotations,
Yeah.
but I mean that with the greatest possible respect and admiration. When people give these Zoom talks, I'm always interested in what's in their libraries and what's in the background. And I noticed you got Teddy Roosevelt and Winston Churchill back there behind you. And I listened to your comments and your remarks, and it's obvious that the essence of their leadership had an influence in your artistic endeavors. You mentioned Teddy Roosevelt exploring the River of Doubt. That book by Candace Millard is one of the most interesting, fascinating, provocative books I've read in the last 10 years.
It's just an incredible book.
Well, first of all, it's medically interesting that he survived, losing 45 pounds, getting some type of illness, whether it was malaria or some parasitic illness.
Yeah, he
And,
asked his son to leave him behind.
The book is by Candace Millard, who wrote Destiny of the Republic about the medical care of not Grover Cleveland, but I'm blocking on my name. It's Garfield, President Garfield.
Garfield.
It's about the medical care of Garfield. And that book reiterates what I tell everybody. We're all victims of when we get sick and who cares for us when we're sick.
And
It-
and the context of the times when we get sick.
The problem with Garfield, he was right at the axis, the byways of the battle between the germ theory, probing the wound, and I don't want to take up too much time, but the interesting thing was his lead doctor was a fellow by the name of Dr. Bliss, who did everything wrong. And the newspaper headline simply said, "Ignorance is bliss," which I think is the worst thing you can say about any doctor.
I know.
You know, we're all victims of when we get sick and who takes care of us.
Well, case in point, I don't mean to interrupt, but you know, when George Washington died, he was taken care of by 3 physicians, as you very well know.
Yes.
You know, his family physician, Dr. Craik, Dr.
Right.
Brown, and Dr. Dick.
Dr. Dick was the young guy.
Dr. Dick was the young guy.
Yeah.
While James Craik had bled Washington 3 or 4 times, and bleeding was a therapy. I mean, what Washington had was some kind of viral epiglottitis,
Yes.
basically suffocated to death. But the treatment, the mainstay of the treatment was bleeding.
It was bleeding.
He was bleeding. So Dr. Dick shows up and he knows what to do. He says the general needs a tracheostomy. He
Yes.
has a hole in his windpipe.
Yes.
Dr. Brown takes Dr. Craik by the shoulder, takes him into a corner and says, "We can't let Dr. Dick operate on the general."
Yeah.
I saw him pull a tooth out of a slave a couple of weeks ago and he bled like hell for hours.
Yeah.
So
Well-
I mean, George Washington could have had a tracheostomy and Dr. Dick could have done it or would have done it.
You know, we all talk about bleeding. And it was Benjamin Rush in Philadelphia, probably one of the most famous physicians in America, whose motto was bleed, clister, and purge. bleed the patient, give him cathartics, get all the evil humors out. But there's a recent history of surgery by Ira Rutkow, who gave me a very interesting view of bleeding. And his thesis was that bleeding is associated with menstruation and birth. And therefore, psychologically, were uplifting events in the evolution of an illness. If a woman is menstruating, that portends the future of birth and the progeny of humanity. And if there's bleeding around the time of birth, birth is essentially a happy event. I never looked at it this way, there was an aura of optimism and health surrounding bleeding and parturition. And that gave future doctors the thought that bleeding, let's do it because it's associated with menstruation and birth. Interesting.
Very
side.
interesting. I have a
Hey,
kind of
I'm going to
more-
interrupt because I'm on the East Coast here and I got to put my daughter to bed. But
Oh.
Uncle Myles,
Rachel, had I not seen you there? My goodness.
well, I was listening, and actually, so I'm Uncle Myles, or I'm Miles's niece, and actually, your grandniece was also listening, but she refuses to go on camera.
Okay.
So Jazz is here too, and the dog is here, and it's the East Coast, so I'm gonna have to go because she's got early school in the morning. But you're a huge inspiration to me. I'm so glad you invited me. I love you, and I can't wait to go to California again.
Well, me too. And I mentioned your book. I don't know if you heard, but I mentioned No Visible
Yeah,
Bruises.
No Visible Bruises. Yeah.
Yeah, you
Yes,
should go
I-
out and get that because, it's a big problem these days. Well,
Ye-
not only
yeah.
these days, but before.
Yeah.
of
I have
domestic
another
violence.
book coming out in March. I'll email you about it.
Thanks, Rachel.
Okay.
All
By
right.
the way,
Yeah.
Leo, I just wanted, this is kind of a flip remark about bleeding. You gave a more scholarly account, but my wife gives anesthesia for a couple of plastic surgeons, one in Santa Monica, one in Beverly Hills. And the ophthalmic oculoplastic surgeon operates mostly on eyelids, brow lifts, upper and lower lids. And he freaks out when there's a little bleeding in the upper eyelid. And because, what's going to happen, the patient's going to end up with a black eye and it doesn't look good. And I like to tease him. He's probably the finest oculoplastic surgeon in the United States. And I can't mention the names of the people that he's operated on, but they include 3 secretaries of state and everybody you can think of in the entertainment world and so on. And when I hear these stories about bleeding in the upper lid for fixing I say, Mike, bleeding isn't bleeding unless you can hear it. That's bleeding.
Boy.
When it hits the ceiling,
Yeah.
that's bleeding.
Yeah, there's a surgeon talking right there. Myles, I got to run. This has been a treat. When the dust settles, we'll get together.
Absolutely.
We'll have a lunch, and we're going to charge it to the Alumni Society.
Absolutely.
See you soon.
You can
Myles?
charge, you can do. Anyway, I think that the time is late, it's 7:20. And we appreciate you joining to this event. And Myles, all of a sudden, you became a different man in front of my eyes. You grew up. And and it's fascinating to see how people utilize their life effectively. And we're looking forward to see more of you. And again, you'll get invitation to the November 20th Doctor Symphony, and hope to see many of you there. And so thank you, Esther Blaugrund and Myles Lee, for being so cooperative. It was a wonderful evening, and I would like to wish all of you a happy week and happy Labor Day.
Healthy.
Oh, thank you. It's been an honor and a privilege for me, that's for sure.
Yes.
And something totally unexpected. So thank you for this.
Opportunity.
Give them a round of applause.
Myles, it's Bina. I just want to say good night. It was a very, very interesting watching everyone and all the accomplishments, all the accomplished things that you have done. And hopefully we will communicate later.
Absolutely. Thank you, Bina.
Take care. Good night.
Okay. All of
Esther,
you, Myles
Professor
Lee's lovers, very nice.
Steve, I'm just honored you showed up for this. Steve Lindquist, we go back so
Thank
far, it's
Okay.
unbelievable.
I feel like a little bit of an imposter, but I don't care. I really enjoyed it. So
Oh, it's
Thank
just marvelous seeing you.
great,
Okay.
great to see you too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night to all of you.
Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night, Myles.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Esther, so much.
It was a
Sandra, thanks
wonderful- a
for all the
great
hard work.
reunion, a great reunion for you.
Marvelous.